Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 67. Today I'm talking with Caleb Leisure of Caleb Leisure Wines. He's a super thoughtful winemaker, and we had a great conversation about how he started, working with Tony Coturri, the intricacies of working with Georgian Kevry, and his farming. A quick reminder that there's a Patreon at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast. The link is in the show notes also. Any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend is a great way to help out too. Here we go.
Yeah, you might hear some acorns.
Yeah.
This tree is just...
Yeah, I saw a squirrel.
Yeah, this is like a little squirrel paradise here.
Yeah. Seems
From roof to roof.
Very good.
Yeah.
Nice. What were your early wine experiences? What kind of got you started down the path of it?
Yeah, so I think it really started when I was living in New York, and this was maybe in 2008 or something like that.
Okay.
And I had a buddy of mine who was in the fine wine department at Christie's.
Okay.
And I was on a very different career track. I was teaching and tutoring and writing, and I thought I was kind of heading toward academia. And there's a buddy who was in an MFA program I was in, and he worked at Christie's, so he invited us to these kind of preposterous events that we had no business attending. And we went because it was a blast, and it was just a wild glimpse into that other world in New York.
Yeah.
And so, what a kind of perverse pleasure it was just to be a fly on the wall for some of the auctions. And anyway, so we would go to these events, and like the Auspice de Beaune event, and we would smuggle like the dregs of these Burgundy bottles, and we'd take them back to the BYO Chinese, along with some other fresh bottles that a lot of the young folks who were working at Christie's were there. And we would just have a little collection, and most of what these guys were drinking were natural wine. So that was really my first exposure was even to the idea of natural wine.
Okay. You were kind of on a literary track before, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. But just kind of, so wine was always, I grew up in the area, or in the East Bay, at least in California. And my parents drank some wine, but they weren't wine drinkers in the kind of connoisseur sense. But I just had no interest in it whatsoever. I remember actually being in college, being invited to go up to some tasting up in Sonoma. Maybe it was, I can't even remember where it was. Somewhere in Carneros. Maybe it was Domaine Carneros. And I remember being laughed essentially out of the room, shamed by the tasting, by the gentleman who was working in the tasting room.
Okay.
Because I think I actually asked, they had the list of all the tasting notes.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked about the process. And I think one of the things was like cocoa nibs.
Yeah.
It's like, so, at what point in the process are the cocoa nibs added? I was like that far disconnected from the process of wine. So it took kind of, moving away to discover it. And I think a lot of it was, I didn't kind of slowly come into natural wine as an interest. It hit me all at once.
Okay.
So I was not coming from the conventional side whatsoever. It was really the idea of natural wine that exploded my interest. Yeah.
And it must have been kind of exploding in the city at that time. I imagine also in New York. Must have been a pretty great place in the world to be at during that time.
It was cool. It was, and there weren't that many places open at that particular moment. And it was very small, and it pushed up against the grain, and there was an element of it felt very countercultural, and I suppose that appealed to me as well. But I think so many of us just need that initial gateway, whatever it is, into wine, and once that sort of opens up, then it opens sort of an insatiable thirst for knowledge and understanding, and so I used that, like my springboard was. I worked for Thirst Wine Merchants in New York City, and or rather in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene, and that's where I learned most of like my early experiences with natural wine. There was a shop that specialized in natural wine. And yeah, I figured out pretty quickly the retail side of things was not for me.
Okay.
And it was more that I just wanted to be in production. So I think I've always been a person who sort of needs to do the thing that I'm passionate about. Whether that's, before I fell into the wine, I really wanted to write, and I was an English major, and it just felt sort of incomplete unless I was going to try it myself. And similar thing with wine, I think. I wanted to understand how it was made. How do you get these flavors? Where is this coming from? And I guess I'd had enough experience, with conventional wine to kind of just be unexcited by it, and just never sparked any interest for me, despite the fact that it easily could have. It's not like natural wine has to be the gateway for interest into the world of wine. It triggered something in me. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Yeah. So is that sort of when you started making your way to France and doing some? Yeah.
So I worked in New York. I didn't really have an idea of what I wanted to do. Like the wine was really just an interest.
Yeah.
And it just kind of kept consuming a bigger portion of my life and my headspace. And I never intended it to be a career.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if what I have is a career, but it's it was always just pursuing an interest, and I knew what I was interested in, and I stuck close to that. And like I said, it was first I wanted to get a good base knowledge, so I did the WSET stuff, as well, and you're going through the motions of what you think you need to do to learn, and that was actually like a tremendous base background knowledge.
Sure.
From there, I was in New York for, I think 7 years.
Okay.
And just all the while, kind of the second half of the time I was there, I got interested in it and started to hang out at the local bars, and made friends with some somms out there who were interested in natural wine. And it was just an interest. But then we moved to London.
Okay.
My wife's mother was really ill, and so we went over there, and that was always sort of part of the plan, is to spend some time in London.
Okay,
and
great.
Again, I didn't really know what I was going to do over there, but when you're in your 20s, sometimes it's just enough to be in a place, and that's how London was for us. So I was actually working in the cheese world over there.
Oh, okay.
So I was a cheesemonger at Neal's Yard Dairy, and it was a fantastic time. And actually, it was like an amazing incubator for an understanding of wine. And and at that moment, like, London was absolutely exploding, even more so than New York.
Okay.
Just with interest in natural wine, and there were fairs. And that I went to the very first raw wine fairs.
Oh, wow.
Back then, they were
Nice.
different than they are now. It was small and scruffy, and Isabel was really the first person who helped me reach out to producers.
Okay.
And so, my time in London was really just a springboard to spending time in France.
Okay.
And so I was always based in London, but I had a pretty flexible schedule, and I was able to spend good chunks of time. But again, I always thought I was on a different career path. I never thought I was pursuing a career. It was really just I had flexibility, which was a great gift, and as was like being abroad. And so I was able to go away for a couple weeks at a time, and I would essentially travel. All the travels were based on interest in wine. And I found a few producers who were willing to kind of let me get my hands dirty.
Yeah.
And that's when I think I fell hard for the idea of, I don't know, the kind of the complete lifestyle, and the dedication that is required. I mean, I think I understood from the outset that it was a really tough gig, and nothing's given to you, and that it's humbling, and it requires meticulous attention to detail, and also creativity, and I don't know, it appealed. I think also for me at that moment, I was feeling a little burned out with on the academic side of things,
Okay.
and I was writing, and I'd finished a manuscript and was shopping it around, but didn't really have any concrete bites. And I was kind of growing a little disillusioned with the literary world. And at the moment, the idea of making something that was really tangible felt like such a beautiful counterpoint to the more kind of nebulous happenings of my mind. And when you're living in New York amongst other writers, you can kind of normalize the behavior of like sitting down in front of a computer or a typewriter for hours at a time and justifying it and going to like crippling debt because of it. But at a certain moment, you kind of I don't know, you remove yourself from that situation and you get a little clarity and you think, okay, maybe this isn't the best path.
Yeah, you're kind
forward.
of looking at it from the outside a little bit, maybe, or something.
Yeah, and that's right, and that's it. And when you're in it, and I really wanted to make it work. I really wanted to be a writer, but just because you write, I mean, at a certain point, like the romance begins to fade when you can't figure out how to monetize it. And I guess that was sort of the crossroads for me. And I still write, and I'm still trying to write, but I'm sort of removed from the pressure of trying to monetize it, and that's been like a real gift because it's something I can enjoy without the pressures of that. I mean, that's how I try to look at it as failed novelist, right?
That seems like it'd be just freeing.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be able to do that.
Yeah, because I mean, I know from other friends who have had success as novelists that that's a grind too, and it can be really, really tough and challenging, and it's not a well-paid gig either, and as tough as it is to kind of make a go of it at wine, I think it's equally tough in the literary world unless you're kind of a superstar.
Right. So it doesn't pay the big bucks like natural wine does.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So that was really, it was a real monetary decision. Yeah, I know. I mean, my wife jokes that like, okay, so your fallback plan was to be a natural winemaker. But I've always sort of operated just moving from, point of interest to point of interest.
Sure.
And I've never been, to my own detriment, probably, I've never been that career driven. I did have a real job once upon a time when I was first out of college, and I absolutely detested it. And there was a lot of kind of corporate rah-rah, and I was working as a copywriter in Silicon Valley and, using my degree, quote unquote. But I just hated it. And I wanted to write, and that's what precipitated the move to New York. And in a similar way, at a certain point, I did realize that I wanted to make wine.
Yeah.
And the writing thing was kind of, petering out a little bit, or at least my enthusiasm for it was. And, it's a natural progression between, the romantic idea of something versus the kind of, the commercial realities of it.
Sure.
And that's sort of what it's taken me a while to. I mean, the same thing has happened with wine too. Is it undoubtedly started as a romantic notion because I didn't really understand what it took to make wine. Like I could make wine. My experiences in France taught me to make wine, and I felt comfortable with the process. I knew what I was interested in, but I didn't really understand the ins and outs of the industry. And, I was an English major. I had no business acumen whatsoever. Yeah. And as a side note, it was really funny that a couple of years ago, I was invited to go back to UC Berkeley, which is my alma mater, and, of course you kind of have these visions, maybe someday you'll be invited back. And like, of course it was always just like as a writer or,
Yeah.
But for me, I was invited back to speak about wine at the Haas Business School.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I had really nothing constructive to say because I still don't know anything about the business side of making wine. I'm a terrible businessman, and I don't have much passion for it, unfortunately. But it was kind of an ironic moment where it's like. Have I made it? Is this the sign? And absolutely not, because this was just a bunch of like very eager business students who wanted to pick the brains of people who were actually in the industry. And every time I kind of go to those things, I realized all like the really, prescient questions I failed to ask myself when I was starting in wine that now I know to ask, or I know to consider. So I'm on a wild tangent here, but anyway, this is all to say that winemaking happened because I was continually pursuing an interest. It became stronger and stronger. I moved back to California because we couldn't afford to live in London. We were actually looking to buy a place, and believe it or not, it was the only place, I think, one of the only places in the world that could make the Bay Area seem affordable.
Right. Yeah.
And my family is out here, and obviously I had the wine bug, so I wanted to get it going. And at a certain point, I think if you want to make wine, you just have to do it.
Yeah.
You can intern forever. You can travel the world and garner experience, but until you're doing it yourself, and the stakes are a little bit higher, and the mistakes are your own. I don't think you can learn well until you're making wine in that place where you're going to be. And also it's just different when you're making your own stuff.
Yeah.
So I returned to California with next to no idea of how to do it. And I just started cold calling people. And this was in 2013, 14. So not that long ago, really.
Yeah.
Although it sometimes feels like I'm the old guy one of the old guys on the wine circuit.
I was going to say, I mean, fairly small natural wine community still at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think when I first started to make wine, and I was working the first place I landed was up at Katuri.
Right.
And at that particular moment when I was making my first vintage in 2016, there were very few folks working 0-0. And I just had no interest in working any other way, or at least that was the starting point.
Okay.
And I certainly wouldn't have been, there was no way to make non-0-0 wines working up at Katuri.
Sure.
It's just,
that's the way it is.
It's the way it is. And so I from an early point in my winemaking career, I knew that's the route I wanted to go.
Okay.
And I didn't want to use chemical intervention as a crutch, simply because it felt like a slippery slope.
Okay.
But anyway, so I started up at Katuri, and it was an amazing experience, because, like I said, I started out with essentially no understanding of how the industry worked. It's one thing to understand how to make wine, or have an idea of how to make wine, which, by the way, I'm still learning, of course.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the great pleasure of what I do, is that it's endless. There's no mastery. There's no kind of moment of expertise, I think, that you reach. It's just a constant kind of learning and teaching and humbling. So I don't know. To me, like that's what's really beautiful about the process, and that's we have. Again, I'm on a tangent, but we have just a really finite number of times that we're able to make wine. I mean, it's once a year, unless you're working in different hemispheres.
Sure.
So it's just there's not enough opportunity for mastery, and there's too many variables.
Yeah, I mean, every vintage is different. I'm sure. Like
that's it.
2023, I think, was kind of unique for a lot of people. Where maybe their first vintage that was sort of that drawn out and absolutely. Moderate.
Yeah, no, I don't even know what normal is. I think I've been making wine for almost 10 years, and I think I've had like maybe one quote unquote normal harvest. Okay. So whatever that means these days. But it is amazing, because talking to Tony, or I have another dear friend, Derek Trowbridge, who's Old World Winery, and he's been at it for a long time, and these guys, they do have kind of an encyclopedic memory of each vintage, each harvest, and you can throw out a year, and they're going to be able to tell you what the vintage was like and what that experience was like, and it's always different, so there's always the vintage variability, and to me, this is part of what was so attractive about natural wine, is that we're not operating from a place of trying to, of like aiming toward a wine, we're the word that Tony used that I really love is just shepherding. And, he would also say we're sort of winemakers are glorified janitors. And in a way it's true in the sense that like most of what we're doing is cleaning and making sure that things are clean. And then there's that 10% that is everything else that imbues all the cleaning with a sense of purpose and like beauty. So yeah, I mean, there's no like arrival at a point of expertise, I don't think.
Yeah.
And I haven't been doing it for that long. And you get better at it and you learn the mistakes to avoid, but I don't know, it'd be really boring if you kind of, figured it out completely. That's what keeps it fun. Yeah.
What kind of drew you up there to Sonoma Mountain and working with Tony? Was it just, I mean, it's kind of been doing it longer, I guess, than anybody in California.
That's what it was. I mean, as you mentioned, there's just a very short list of people that, I could reach out to at that moment. Not a lot of people working naturally. I mean, I think I reached out to Brock and Donkey and Goat, and those are some of the bigger ones. And La Clarine was operating at that moment. Ambith, certainly. But yeah, Tony was the first one to kind of open the doors for me, and he made time for me in a way that sort of other people didn't. And I just went up there looking to pick his brain and open-minded. And it was right at the moment where Isabelle Legrand's book, Natural Wine, had just came out. And so I was using that as a reference in a lot of ways because I was coming from New York and London, and I didn't really have a strong idea of what was going on in California.
Okay.
And I think that's around the time that John Bonnet wrote about the new California wine as well. So there were some people I was reaching out to from that book as well. But again, that wasn't grounded in the same kind of natural world that I was in France, and I was sort of less interested in that. But again, I was just trying to get a sense of how the industry worked, but I knew what I wanted to do, and I was feeling I got started a little bit late. So I felt like I really needed to start. I felt pressure to start to do my own thing. Yeah. And, my wife was pregnant as well. So I've never really been a winemaker without fatherhood sort of being an impactful thing in that world. So that's another conversation though. But it is sort of interesting because I really didn't have those experiences of being able to kind of travel extensively and to intern extensively in my 20s. Like I fell into this, so I'm 42 now. I fell into this in my late 20s is when my first kind of interest began to percolate. And because of that, I felt, just pressure to get going. So I started up at Tony's because he made time for me. And I showed up with Isabelle's book, and we chatted for 2 hours. He opened a bunch of wine, and he could tell I was really interested and passionate and serious about it. And the timing worked out such that he had an opening. The fellow who was helping him part-time was about to stop, and he asked if I'd be willing to, if I wanted to come in and step in and fill in for him. And of course, knowing, and this was after maybe 2 months of sort of landing in California and landing in Oakland, and so the opportunity fell in my lap. And I knew from the outset that it wasn't going to be a high-paying gig. It was sort of more of a pseudo internship situation, but it was still, really attractive. And his cellar is unlike anything else in California. It reminded me a lot more of the places I'd spent time in France. And it was rustic, and it felt like it was honest and authentic, and it just spoke to me in the same way that Tony did. I mean, he's a real genuine artifact, I mean, he he does things a certain way, and he is pretty dogmatic about the way he does things and his beliefs, and it was really, really appealing to me. And I stepped in a moment where he hadn't been making much wine for the last, I don't know, 3-4 years. And parts of the cellar seemed a little kind of frozen in time. And there were a lot of old vintages hanging around, lots of old barrels that, for whatever reason, just didn't see the bottle. And my job was to, as it evolved, was to kind of go through the wines, clean up the cellar. I like to think that I was able to imbue a little bit of energy into the scene because I was enthusiastic and I didn't know anything. And I was eager to learn and pick his brain. And in 2015, he decided to make more wine than he had in a really long time.
Nice.
And so he invited me essentially to be a part of every aspect of the harvest. So I think we processed maybe 30 tons that year, and for him that was like pretty light, but it was more than he had done in a while. And it's hard to believe if you've ever been up to the space, but he was, I think, producing upwards of, I think, 120 tons. I could be wrong, but I mean,
really?
At least 100 tons at one time. And you go up to the space. I don't know if you've been up there, but
I haven't.
It's worth the pilgrimage.
I'll get there one day.
It's just it just would seem impossible, I mean, and he does things in sort of the oldest school way imaginable, the hardest way. So there's no forklift. There's everything is done by hand. I mean, all the machinery, what machinery we're using is very rudimentary and basic, and it's just a lot of physical labor, So I sort of knew nothing else at that moment. So, only recently have I come to kind of understand that, there are advantages to having like a bin dumper, for instance. Not that we use one, but but it was just never part of like the lexicon of like making wine for me. I just didn't know. So I was really starting at a point of like deeply naive to everything. I knew how to make wine, but that was about it. And so that first year in 2015, where he invited me to be, kind of his wingman at every point of the process and make decisions on blending, make picking decisions, work on contracts with growers. It was trial by fire, and he just kind of let me do it. I mean, I suppose, you could look at it that it was, he was definitely using the opportunity for like my enthusiasm to, inject some life into the winery. And I was just so keen to do it. And like I said, it wasn't a high paying gig, but it really didn't matter. I was so enamored with the idea of doing it. And it was so exciting. And I just can't imagine any other place where I could have been where I had so much autonomy and I was like in charge of so many decisions. I didn't have my hand held. And like I said, I was able to go through a lot of the back vintages and make decisions on wines and blends. And there were a lot of old barrels that were, 10 years old. And these are 0.0 wines, right?
Yeah.
And not everything held up necessarily, but a lot of things did. And it was an incredible lesson into the world of like stability and wine faults and what 0.0 wines can do with time. And like I said, it was just like an immense, dense education in a single year. And the aim for me was always to make a little bit of wine. And in 2016, Tony sort of offered, he said, well, look, I can't really pay you anymore, and I can't pay you, much. But how about this? You give me a couple of days of the week to help me, and you can make as much wine as you want. Wow. So he gave me the proverbial corner of the cellar to kind of do my own thing. And that's really how it started. And so again, I'm not starting from, this was never like an execution of a grand vision. This has been year by year, pursuing an interest, figuring it out as I go along, tweaking, learning from my mistakes, and hopefully arriving at, a better place ultimately. Yeah.
Yeah. That 2015 vintage, it sounds like it's probably about as close as you could get to kind of doing it on your own, but with like a little bit of that kind of that safety net of Tony, but
absolutely.
But like so many decisions and things like that on your own.
Absolutely. And it was, he was the one who, the stakes were high for him too. So it was just remarkable that he was willing to put me in that position. I just don't think that there would have been another situation that I could have fallen into that would have offered that kind of intensity and that real kind of, holistic experience. It was every aspect of the wine world. And then like understanding how to sell wine, understanding how to work with distribution. So for as naive as I was when I entered the fray, I came out of it within a couple of years feeling like I had a pretty good understanding of how things worked. Didn't mean I was savvy, but I kind of knew how things worked generally, and that's a big impediment. And, it's one thing that I wish I had a better understanding of when I was first starting. And I've tried to kind of do what I can to pass down what I've learned kind of the hard way to other folks. And again, not that I know much, but I kind of know a lot of mistakes to avoid. So my education has been more about like learning what not to do, and arriving at a point where I'm beginning to understand what the appropriate things to do are. But it's taken a while for sure. But anyway, that 2015 harvest was a real gift in a lot of ways. And then 2016 came along, and that was my first opportunity to kind of do my own thing. And Tony kind of stayed out of the way and let me do what I wanted. I mean, he definitely had his opinions, of course, and I was interested in very different things than he was. I mean, I should say that like my first interests were in. I was really interested in Cleffery. I was really interested in clay. The Gravner wines were like my sort of epiphany wines.
Were they? Okay.
Yeah. And I had access to them simply because some of these Psalms in New York had bottles they're hanging on to, and they're a little bit more approachable cost-wise then. I don't know. I was just really drawn to the idea of clay. And 2016, I was working in barrel and really bought a little bit. First fruit I bought was Viognier and Marsan from the Sierra foothills from El Dorado, Sumacao vineyards, which was a connection I made through La Clarine.
Yeah. That's a great vineyard. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And the grower Sheila is a wonderful, wonderful grower, and I've continued to work with them because I know now how lucky I've been to work with people that like Sheila, who I don't know, she's the best. She's willing to have real conversations. She knows her shit. And she's just a great grower. And, she's not close-minded. She shares information. So it does feel a little more collaborative. And that's not always the case, And oftentimes there's a lot of ego in the industry. And she is one of the more egoless, growers out there. That's where I started. And I'm not keen to let that one go because she's been so easy to work with. It's far. There's some logistical challenges, but so 2016 was where I did it myself. And I mean, once you make those first couple barrels, there's kind of no going back, unfortunately. And it was a funny place because, it was 2016. Let's see. When was my son born? Yeah, he was, my wife was pregnant at that moment. Yeah. So it was just like a real big point of transition. And like I said, if I I didn't have a career in mind. I was hoping it would work out and assuming I would be able to figure it out as I went along because I had the guidance of Tony. And I put a lot of faith in that. And like I said, I felt pressure to kind of make it happen. In 16, I made 2 tons worth of wine.
Yeah.
And in 17, I think I made 22 tons that year.
Okay.
Which is a pretty big jump.
Yeah.
And isn't that far from kind of what's comfortable for me right now. And in order to do so, I mean, that was the year where I really I knew if I was going to do it, I just had to jump in, and I wasn't going to be able to kind of work another job. We had a baby on the way. It was like, I had to make this my thing.
Sure. And
that was what the 17 vintage was about. And so before the vintage, I brought in 10 Georgian Qvevri.
Yeah.
And that had been like a long-standing desire to work with the clay. And I had to launch a crowdfunding campaign, which went against every bone in my body. It was kind of
I think I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, it's embarrassing looking back on it now too. And like I was even like mispronouncing Qvevri and like, just having to, I mean, it's like that with anything that you do, you look back on it 10 years later and it's embarrassing. But it was a means to an end. And I started from nothing. I had no monetary backing. I had really no savings. And so I had to do what I did, which is launch this little crowdfunding campaign. And at that moment, this is when there was the bars, the local bars were big supporters. So, Bradford at Ordinaire and DC and Lisa at the Punchdown were really big early supporters. And basically what they did is they kicked me some funding, and I would pay them back in wine, essentially.
Okay.
And it took me a couple years to kind of like have enough wine to pay it back and actually begin to start earning my own, seeing any kind of profit, for lack of a better term. But that's what got me going, and that's what started the project. And, I was also in this is the other aspect where, Tony's situation was remarkable because he had a bonded winery and half of the cellar was an earthen floor that he had previously dug out to make a bigger barrel room. And so I kind of, part of my job, or the job I gave myself, was to clear out all the old barrels. And there were maybe 100 plus barrels in there, older vintages.
Okay.
And to figure out what to keep and what wasn't worth keeping, put together blends, all with the idea of clearing the space out. And I did so, and he let me do it. And he egged me on. So I kind of blame Tony.
Okay.
I blame DC a little bit too, because he from the Punchdown, he was like, oh man, I mean, yeah, Katuri and Qvevri are just like a match made in heaven. And at that moment, the Georgian wines were kind of coming into the market and getting a little bit of notoriety. And again, that stuff just spoke so directly to me. And I brought him in. It took me several years to and I'd put out the feelers, years in advance. I traveled to Georgia with my wife in 2015, 2014. It's all a little nebulous now, but to kind of put the feelers out and try to, figure out a way to bring some in.
Yeah. What was that process like, importing 10 of those? Because they're big,
it was
heavy,
a pain in the ass.
Fragile.
Yeah, it was terrible. It was terrible because, it took me 3 or 4 years to find someone that would help me do it.
Okay.
Took 2 trips to Georgia and, a lot of hoops to jump through. And initially I just wanted to bring over 1 or 2, and I thought that was going to be feasible. And I was talking to a couple importers who were maybe just going to throw a Qvevri on the current container coming over with Georgian wine, and that just never really materialized. And also, it became really apparent that the cost of shipping 1 or 2 over was going to be absolutely absurd. And so this is how the whole crowdfunding thing came to be.
Okay.
It became really clear that the most cost-effective thing to do was to fill the shipping container and to go by sea.
Okay.
So
okay.
It was going to cost as much to ship 1 or 2 over as it would a 10.
Got it.
I didn't have the money for it, and that's what started the crowdfunding campaign.
So I imagine, I mean, the shipping for something like that is probably close to equal to the cost of
that's exactly right. Exactly right. And the Quevries, relatively speaking, were at that moment were pretty affordable too. So I mean, there were I think I paid like $1.50 or $1 something like that, $1.50, $1.25 per liter to give you an idea. So 1,000 liter vessel might have cost me $1,500, which is an incredible bargain when you think about how much they go for now, and also just how expensive Italian amphora are, and but the shipping cost was roughly the same cost as the vessel. So I had to raise whatever it was, upwards of $20,000, and I was able to do that with the crowdfunding campaign. But then, of course, I owed like every last drop of wine that I was going to make that year to the wine bars and to the contributors. So
you owe favors to a lot of people.
Exactly. So it took a while to catch up on that front, but that's how it started. And I dug giant holes into the earthen cellar, and I buried them, and I wanted it to do it in the most traditional way possible. And that was, I just felt like there were no shortcuts to be made, and I wanted to do it. And I think that's kind of how I operate. If I had thought a little bit more clearly about it, and I would have done things probably a little bit differently. And now I'm no longer in the Kateri space. I actually had to unbury them at a certain point, and
that sounds even more difficult than
burying. Well, and burying them was so much fun too, and it was you're so energized by this experience, and it was such an exciting time, and it felt like a time of new beginnings, and it certainly was for us with a baby and these egg-shaped vessels, I don't know. I was just so in love with the idea of doing it, and I sort of didn't know better, So I was just able to make it happen at whatever cost. And so 17 was like a big harvest, and it was really my commitment to myself that this is what I was going to do. But again, I didn't have like a grand vision, and I just knew vaguely what I wanted to do in terms of varieties I wanted to work with. I wanted to be anchored in the Georgian traditions, and I wanted to do a lot of prolonged skin macerations. I wanted to work with maybe more aromatic varieties, and I was just trying to think about what things might work in California, what might be interesting in like natural companions with clay. But then I was also just at the beginning of understanding how to kind of make connections with growers and buy fruit, and so really just kind of learning as I went along. But I did have Tony, to kind of guide me, and that was useful with his 40 plus years of experience. And I had other friends in the winemaker friends at that moment who were able to provide guidance, and then a lot of support from the local wine bars. And I really can't overstate the importance of that and the kind of community that was built out of those brick and mortar spots that really convinced me that this was something worth doing. And because it was really, it's scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on it for just a second there, but how much did you want to kind of anchor yourself in that Georgian winemaking style and tradition outside of just using the Quevry?
Well, I mean, the idea was always, you want to be respectful of the traditions, and but there's a reality of working in California, and you have to be respectful of the California fruit and what it is, and it was always about working with again, as Tony would say, like properly grown organic fruit. And I think there's a difference between organic fruit and properly grown organic fruit, whatever that means. It's nebulous, but you know when you see it. And I borrowed a lot of Georgian ideas in the sense that long macerations for certain varieties, and also the Georgians have this really beautiful idea of they say that leaving the wine with the skins and stems is leaving the wine with the mother.
Right.
And this idea of sort of raising the wine along with the skins and stems and providing stability and providing nutrients. And when your aim is to make wines without chemical additives or interventions, then it just seemed like such a natural way of providing stability. So I wanted to make 0-0 wines, and the clay, both the clay and the style that the clay kind of not demands, but kind of requests, all feels like part of the best way to make unsulfited wine, or it did to me at that moment. And that's really where the interest in clay began. Outside of the fact that I was just so drawn to the fact that it's a natural material, it's made by hand. They're all a little bit different. They're all unique, and they all have personalities, different oxygen transfer rates, different sizes, shapes, all the little kind of personality quirks. Yeah, and that's to me like really beautiful. And then there was also the kind of I guess the romantic poet in me that like loved the idea of returning the fruit back into the earth, because of course the vessels are canonical. The shape necessitates a burial or some kind of stability, but of course traditionally a burial. And that means that they are anchored in, they're embedded in the earth. And there is a beauty in the idea of returning the grapes to the soil in a vessel that is made from the soil. And that idea was just so attractive to me. And I got to say, like the first time I remember, like so distinctly, first time I was in Georgia, and we finally made an appointment with a winemaker, and he unburied the top of a qvevri he had, and he opened it up, and it felt, it was late at night, and we were in this really rustic Marani, and he had sort of this open top facility. He could open the top of this beautiful kind of wooden ceiling that he had made, and like I remember the moon was like out, and the whole thing just felt like very spiritual. And I'm not necessarily a spiritual person, but where I find it is in wine. And like the Georgians have, to get back to your question actually, the Georgians have like a deep reverence for wine and farming especially. And they believe that wine is a gift, is a divine gift. And so I've tried to be really respectful of that. And it's been guiding, because I think there is a culture in the US that's just, it's not about that, It's wine's a commodity. It's something it's social lubricant. It's it's just more commercial driven. And even the natural wine world, especially more recently, I think. And I always try to remind myself like that. I try to gravitate back toward those moments where I felt that so kind of strongly, the reverence that those winemakers have for what they're doing as stewards of the land, and as like humble recipients of this incredible gift that nature provides. So that's kind of the underlying like gravitational pull for the Georgian sensibility and working with qvevri. And every time I work with them, I do kind of feel connected to that more spiritual side. And that's really important and a really because it's so easy to get swamped and bogged down by all the other bullshit of the industry. And it's helpful to kind of have that daily reminder, and working with the vessels, having them there really sort of is that for me. But beyond that, I mean, the more practical terms, the Georgians also, depending on, the region, there are different traditions in terms of leaving a certain percentage of the skins and stems of the cha-cha. So I do that still to this day, and I much prefer to have a longer ferment on some percentage of the skins than just like a direct press. So, or rather, like the difference between pressing something after 3 days, well, you could also achieve perhaps a similar effect, but potentially a healthier fermentation if you use 15%, 20% of the skins and stems, or sometimes just the skins. Just depends on the grapes and what the aim is. But to think about it in terms of, to think of maceration as a percentage, not just like a temporal measurement, and to think about extraction in that way, and also to think about the health of a fermentation. And again, going back to this Georgian idea of leaving the wine with the skins and the stems as much as you can to provide that stability, to provide nutrients. So yeah, I mean, those are like the fundamental things that I always go back to in terms of like those Georgian techniques. And the Qvevris, because of the shape, because of just the way that they operate, they're kind of asking for it. They want a little skin contact, they want you to play and experiment, and the shape is actually really incredibly brilliant. And this is the other deep attraction, is that we have so many kind of modern winemaking devices that emulate what the Georgian Qvevris do. And the concrete eggs, lots of other egg-shaped fermenters. We certainly think about temperature control. And again, if you're bearing a Qvevri, that one of the big perks is that you do have a little bit more temperature stability. Sure. And so they just do a lot of like really intelligent things in this ancient vessel that's been around for millennia. And it's really incredible to think that that such like rudimentary handmade objects can do some really sophisticated things. So for instance, if you're using, imagine we have like a full Kakhetian style 100% skins and stems ferment, all that's going into the Qvevri. The fermentation dies down, we top it up. The skins and stems then, fall to the bottom. And usually what happens is the seeds, where all the more harsh and bitter tannins are, they fall into that cone. And then the lees and then the skins kind of stratify over them. And so the wine doesn't really make, while it's during élevage, it never really makes much direct contact with the seeds themselves. So the seeds are kind of buried and sequestered. And then what you have is the vessels themselves, because of the shape and the slight temperature difference between the core and the outside, there's always going to be movement. There are no hard edges, right? And so you get that movement and the wine circulating over the stems and the skins, and it's like self-filtering. So the wines that I make in that style are often have just this incredible clarity and brilliance, despite the super long, maceration. So the Qvevris themselves really do drive a lot of what I do as a winemaker, because they provide that opportunity to work in this way. And it feels like you're missing out if you don't take advantage of it to a certain degree. because obviously there are other vessels where you can do this, but I'm also just, I love working with clay itself. I don't like to work with plastic. I like to work with natural materials. So yeah, there's a romantic part of it as well. But I can also say that I by and large, I prefer the wines I make in clay to pretty much everything else. And I do find that there's no place to hide with clay.
Okay.
It's a really direct presentation of the fruit, and it's for better, for worse. So mistakes or flaws show up a little more clearly. But when things go well and you're able to showcase the purity of the fruit or the labor of your farming, I think there's no better expression, at least in my experience, for me. And obviously, everyone has different ideas about this. And I'm not anti-barrel. I'm not anti-stainless. I use both in my winemaking. But objectively speaking, I prefer the wines that come out of the clay.
Okay.
And there are, of course, exceptions, and it depends on style. It depends on acidity, and it depends on just what I'm aiming for with the particular wine and the style. But I just so love working with them. And as I mentioned earlier, like there are aspects of the industry that are really tough and that can kind of bog you down. So whatever is able to keep you attached to, what drew you in initially, and attached to that core, that like excitement.
Yeah.
Like that's really important. So the recoveries do that for me on a daily basis. And I can't really say the same about like a variable capacity stainless tank.
Okay. Yeah. Got it.
But there are all other sorts of benefits that the clay does provide as well. But yeah.
And you said each one kind of has its own personality and sort of distinctness. Do you find yourself, does it go so far as you feel like certain styles or certain grapes go better in some of them?
Yeah. I mean, they're also different sizes, so a lot of that is those
just a practice.
It's driven by that. So yes and no. I mean, I have like detailed notes on each individual cuvée and like what's been in there. So they have their own personality because oxygen transfer. Some vessels seem a little tighter than others. Certainly, there's a distinct look to each one. So they're made by a family in Emirati, and I believe that there are 3 different people in the family that make the vessel. So I can tell which family member made the vessel.
Yeah.
They're all kind of distinct in that way, and so some of the openings are a little bit wider. Some of the vessels are easier to climb into. Some have broader shoulders. So some are maybe better, a little more egg-shaped. Some are going to be better for those kind of longer macerations. The ones that are a little bit tighter, and again, this is also gets into this idea of lining the vessel.
Yeah.
But some of the vessels are a little bit tighter, might be better for certain wines. So yeah, I have an idea of what each provides, but to be honest, like a lot of my decisions during harvest are just driven by practicality. And I think a lot of winemakers will tell you the same thing.
Sure.
I wish I had this beautifully executed, precise plan. And, always elements of the plan that I have. I mean, I do bother to kind of draft up a plan, but it always goes to hell.
Yeah.
Just like the same exercise of the business plan. I always bother to draw up a business plan every year, and it just goes to shit. But I think the exercise is important. So it's the same way with harvest. And oftentimes it doesn't, your best laid plans, aren't always met. And sometimes you're just putting something in a vessel because it's open and it's free. So yeah, wine, it just ends up being more like a puzzle to solve. But I do keep track of what goes into each vessel, and I do know like what the state of each one is. I know which ones have been problematic in the past. I know which ones are prone to seeping. I know which ones need to be relined more frequently. I know which ones are due for a relining. So they each have their own personality, but in terms of how that manifests in the wine, I wish I could say that there was, more concrete evidence of that.
Yeah.
But like I said, a lot of what it is just logistics and then understanding oxygen transfer.
Has the sort of care and maintenance and relining beeswax and everything, I imagine that's got to be there's got to be a learning curve to that.
Yeah, I'm still figuring it out.
And probably nobody to really bounce the idea. Or
not really. I do have a couple of friends in Georgia.
Okay.
Like and my distributor here in California, Roni, Roni Select, she brings in a lot of Georgian wine. So I do have connections in that part of the world. And then, just down the street, there's a Georgian restaurant of all things called Piala. And that's been a good sort of network of people coming through with that kind of Georgians coming through as well and connection to those winemakers. So I do have like some kind of infrastructure I can tap into, but I never worked in Georgia. I've only just seen things and I've heard recommendations, but I know from traveling to Georgia that, talk to people about how it's supposed to work. And what's your methodology for cleaning? What's your methodology for skin maceration? How do you seal the vessels? All of these kind of basic fundamental questions that you would think after whatever it is, 8,000 years of knowledge, that like it would be dialed in.
Yeah.
Everybody has a totally different idea of what works best. In the same day, I visited a producer who we were talking about relining the vessels, and I said, well, how often do you find a need to reline them? He said, no, never. We've had these in our family for these same vessels for hundreds of years, and we've never relined them. And then you go to the next producer, you ask the same question. They say, oh, but you have to reline them every year, just because of sanitation. There's no way to get away with it. Okay. So I don't know. I think it's been a lot of exploration and understanding of what works best for me, understanding different techniques that are used in Georgia, and just finding solutions that work here in the U.S. too.
Yeah, kind of find your own way with it.
Yeah, and then also working with them, when they're buried, and now I have to have them above ground in these sort of crates, these boxes that I built up around them, so they're kind of semi-buried but above ground. Yeah, they're all factors in that. Yeah. Yeah, the understanding how to sanitize them has been a constant evolution of thought and process. Now what I do, so I tried to do it the most traditional way possible, which is essentially slaked lime and then citric acid. And in Georgia, you see people just go in there and they'll neutralize it with just lemon halves, right? Oh. And again, like the closer you can get to those natural solutions, to me, the better. But it's harder to. I don't have as good and affordable access to slaked lime as they do there.
Okay. Yeah.
And they also use baking soda, so I've used baking soda in the past.
Okay.
I've also had vessels that have been tainted, developed the MUFA. And I've tried. So I've learned the hard way. I mean, I don't even really know where to start on this, honestly. But basically, in terms of basic sanitation, my practice now is I use these very gentle chemicals now that we have for sanitation, and the same cleaning products that we've moved over to the winery. And I love them because it's essentially a concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And then a really mild detergent that are compatible with each other. Okay. So normally in the wine industry, you have, or in best practice is kind of a 3-step practice. There's a detergent for really cleaning, and then you have to neutralize that, and then you sanitize it. So there's a sanitizing agent. And each time you're using a lot of water in between, but with these new chemicals that I'm using, it's just they're drain safe. And they're compatible with each other. Yeah. So I just use a little bit of that. I scrub the vessels, and then I get the stuff out of there as quickly as I possibly can. And then I have these electrical coils that I built, and I lower them into the vessels, and I just heat the hell out of them. So it's kind of like a partial refiring.
Yeah.
And I'm able to get them up to 450 degrees, depending on the size of them.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
in terms of sanitation, it's the best thing you can do because you can get in there and you can scrub the things, and I do get into the Quevries and just go at them with a brush the old-fashioned way. And you kind of have to a degree if you're going to really see what's going on, because the surfaces are, they're imperfect and they're little funny little spots and tartaric acid buildup and, all of those things. And then also just understanding what's going on with the beeswax. But now I use electrical coils, and that really has helped with the sanitation. And I learned by losing 2 vessels to MUFA, which I believe it's essentially like a fungal infection.
Okay.
And I think it was more of, it could be both an inside-out problem, in other words, wine seeping, or an outside-in problem, moisture coming into the vessel and in contact with soil and that kind of bacterial presence. And I learned this because, and it's the worst possible experience as a winemaker, to go in and to taste your wine and to taste it manifests as TCA. It's not, but your wine tastes corked straight out of the vessel. And I tried to refire them. This is when they were buried, and I basically had like a little blowtorch, and I relined them, and they were smelling beautiful and clean. And I put wine in them the following year. Same result within 2 weeks.
That quickly?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I knew that there was a problem with the way I buried them, and I knew that there was some unseen issues. I also knew that relining I needed to dial it in, and I knew that there had to be a better way of sanitizing. So those have all been instructional points. So now I use electrical coils. I do sanitize, and I typically reline when I need to. And I've had vessels, since they've been above ground, actually begin to seep on me, which is terrible because it's just, you think you're done with harvest. And this happened in 22 to me. And these little black beads. So the outside of the vessels are lined in or painted with lime. And traditionally, when they're buried, that does add a layer of protection. But I had these little black beads of wine that had managed to seep through the lime, and so I was losing wine from the clay, and I was losing like I don't know, quarter inch, half inch a week, something like that. And you go like, all right, it'll seal up, like the tartaric acid will precipitate, and it'll be okay. And it just turned into like a couple months game of chicken, and at a certain point I lost. And so I had to rack the wine out of those vessels and reline them. And that's just part of the deal. So I did learn that potentially that was what was going on with the vessels when they were buried, which would explain all the bacterial and fungal, buildup. And when I unburied the vessels, they were incredibly stinky on the outside. Yeah.
Huh.
So I had to kind of take a torch to the outside of them, scrub them down, sanitize them in every which way I could before kind of repositioning them in their current setup. So this is all to say that I've had the vessels since 2017, and I'm still figuring out what the best practices. But I've had no problems with them in terms of that since they've been above ground. But now that they're above ground, there's a whole host of other problems that have surfaced. Well, I mean, there was the seepage, but at least I could see it and attack it.
Sure.
But I'm always with Quevries, you're always up against biofilms because there's a headspace that you can't quite. So what most folks do in Georgia is there'll be a glass lid.
Right.
And you seal up the vessel, you leave an inch or two of headspace. And you need that for the expansion and contraction of the wine. But if you bury it all the way, the biofilms, at least in my experience, when I had them buried all the way. And so what I would do, I had them kind of sticking out of the ground, maybe a foot, and then I built these kind of sandboxes around them. I would fill them with sand, and I would go around just watering the sand to keep it moist. And that got rid of the initial biofilm problems that I was getting. Just biofilms are growing on the surface of the wine because you can't top it up in the way that you can a barrel, right?
Yeah.
And those biofilms, they're not all beneficial. This is not like working with a specific strain of flora that is going to work with you. These are biofilms that can destroy your wines and certainly can cause your VA to soar. And that's what's happened. So that's been like my constant battle, is to try to keep the VA down. And a lot of it is because of those biofilms. And I've just tried every which way for, to figure out those solutions. But so when I had them buried all the way and then I used the sand, biofilm problem went away completely.
Okay.
Probably because there's no ingress in oxygen. They're completely sealed. And I've always like I've used everything. I've used argon to purge the space. And then I've used distillate to kind of try to keep the floating on plates on the top to keep things clean.
Okay.
What they use in Georgia are oftentimes are sulfur wicks in the non-toxic, like non-drying clay that they use, and that creates a vacuum and shuts off the space, the headspace. I've tried that, but I really don't like burning sulfur wicks over my wine.
Yeah.
I now have these like new kind of domed sandstone lids that I appropriated from different vessels.
Okay.
And like 3 of the Quevries that actually where the lids fit, but they're all different. So they don't, like the lids don't fit all the vessels. And now what I've done this year, because I'm so sick of making wines that have higher VA levels and I'm so careful with oxygen management during the process during fermentation. And I've really been able to dial that in. And like the finished wines early on have extremely levels, usually more or less lower levels of VA than I used to because I know what I'm doing better than I did before. But I still get these VA spikes with some of the Quevers, but it's uneven and there's no like absolutes. There are no, you can't really draw any absolutes from any one vessel or any one wine. It just, it does kind of feel random in terms of the wines that are really affected by it.
Yeah.
So that's been a big challenge. But this year I've just grown so tired of the conundrum and the problem. And I've done what the Romans have done or did. And what they still do in parts of Portugal and Spain is olive oil.
I was going to ask you about the...
So in my mind, it was always like the last resort. But I guess I'm there.
Okay.
Yeah. So we'll see. I mean, it comes with another host of problems that I still need to solve. But again, I don't know. This is what keeps it fun for me, right? I mean, like every year I'm having to solve these problems and... they're maddening on the one hand, but it keeps you engaged. Yeah. At the very least,
Sounds like it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about kind of what you look for in a vineyard. And I know you've done some farming yourself over the years and worked with some vineyards kind of in a few different AVAs around California also. And
No, I've been really, really fortunate in that I've had access to many different spots and different terroirs, different microclimates. And it's, again, like it just makes you a better winemaker. Makes you a better winemaker when you understand the fruit more completely. And even when you stop farming in those regions, if you have the farming as a point of reference, it can be really helpful, So I've worked in El Dorado. I've worked in Calaveras County, so a bunch of the foothills farming. And I've also worked a little bit in Napa, growing some cab. So so up in Calaveras, it was mostly Rhone varieties, so Viognier, Syrah, and Mourvedre, and cab in Napa. And out here, Pinot in a vineyard in a couple of vineyards, one in Sebastopol and one just here not too far in Pengrove.
Okay. Yeah.
So what I'm looking for in a vineyard seems to be availability. Okay. It's opportunity. And when you're the scale that I am, and when you don't have land of your own, you got to be a little bit of a scavenger, and keep your ear out for opportunity. And it does sort of mean that I'm not executing a vision. I'm inheriting someone else's dream, someone else's vision. And there's frustration in that, but there's also, I don't know, part of, I think, of what we're doing in California, those of us who are having to farm in this way, or not farming at all, because just access is so difficult. You learn to make it work with whatever you have. And, there's that it's that idea of having certain constrictions around creativity that can actually engage it,
Yeah, definitely.
And this is partly what I say just to make myself feel better about not having, this grand vision that I've been able to execute, and plant my own vineyard. But I do think there's merit into learning how to adapt to different vineyards and different sites, and to learn that there are no blanket sort of answers for anything when it comes to viticulture. And man, talk about another endless kind of body of knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's also site specific that you can't, it can be a mistake to think you understand something better than you do just because something worked in one spot. It doesn't mean it's going to work in another. So yeah, I mean, it's the farming has been really important to the way I see the project, but it's also been a little piecemeal, and I'm oftentimes working with varieties that I would not personally choose to work with. But I'm trying to not see that as a limitation. I'm trying to, I try to see that as a challenge. And I do think that increasingly, when I was a little bit younger, I would go kind of chasing for obscure varieties.
Okay. Yeah.
Because it's sexier. And when you're getting into the industry, it has I don't know, if you're working, like we were talking about earlier, like if you're working with Trousseau or something, it has a little more cachet in the industry. And it's not what everyone else is doing. But increasingly, I care less about that. Don't get me wrong, I'm still a sucker for all that stuff. But increasingly, the farming is the most important thing.
Okay.
And so increasingly, I am just trying to farm to the best of my ability, and I'm trying to work with fruit that's been impeccably farmed. And I'm trying to work with growers that will have real conversations about the farming. And for me, like that's the starting point of the project. And without that, there's nothing. It's like I'm not engaged in it otherwise.
Right.
I'm not interested in making wine, just blindly purchasing fruit, having it delivered. And again, there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's not what is a personal excitement. So I want to be as involved as I possibly can. I think a lot of winemakers obviously feel the same way. So, and farming is the very best way to be engaged. So in terms of what I'm looking for in a vineyard, beyond availability, but I think that's kind of it. It's like, it's opportunity to learn, right? Okay. And you carry those lessons along wherever you end up. And, those lessons don't always, lay over the new site perfectly, but they contribute something. Ideally, I'm looking for something that has been grown organically. It's not ideal to have to start from a place of just dealing with soils that have been, that's seen chemicals for decades. It can be resuscitated like fairly quickly, but I don't know. It's always a long game with vineyards. Yeah. But ideally, you're working with something that's organically grown. Ideally, you're working with something with lower disease pressure. I'm trying to make as few inputs as I possibly can. Right. Spray as little as I can. But says the guy making farming Pinot in a fog belt, right? So it can be challenging, certainly. So I think you just have to embrace whatever challenges the site has, and you have to look at it from a perspective of just like the reality of farming. It's just there's no such thing as like perfect farming. It's just you have to make each site work the best it possibly can. You have to tweak it in the way that you see fit. You have to think about the now, the past, the future. You have to have a vision for all of that in every aspect that you're, every task that you're implementing in the vineyard, from pruning to cover crops and compost use and tilling or no tilling. I mean, it's such a long game. So ideally you're looking for me, increasingly, I'm looking for a place where I can be comfortable working in for a long period of time, because, and I haven't done a good job of that, to be honest. Like for whatever reason, I've had to let vineyards go because they've been either too inconvenient, i.e. 3 hours away, and remote sort of farming is almost impossible.
Sure.
I was able to do it only because it was a kind of a rare circumstance in which there was a farmhouse on the property, so I could stay for a couple weeks at a time and just get the work done. But so often I just feel like I'm searching for the best fit farming wise, and I haven't found it just yet.
Okay.
But I've taken on a lot of vineyards and I've let a lot of vineyards go. But again, a lot of that has been just like pure distance, not because a problem with the vineyard or a difficulty with approach, but it's got to make sense in your life.
Right.
And I have 2 small kids, and that is probably the biggest challenge, is just figuring out a way to bring the farming into balance with everything else that you have to do in the cellar, and making time to sell wine, because you have to put on all the hats when you're at the scale that I am, you know. I make between 1,000 and 1,500 cases a year. So that awkward size where I have enough work to hire someone, not enough money to hire someone, and I have enough, I can't do all the work myself, but I'm sort of having to, and you figure out which hats kind of fit the most comfortably.
Okay.
And farming is so integral to the vision of the project, but oftentimes it seems at odds with making it a sustainable project, in terms of the financial gains. Making it work in the margins, and also just the time demands. I mean, there's the things that I want to accomplish from the farming perspective, and the things I look for as a farmer. And I want to stress that I'm very much still learning. I have a couple tremendous mentors, and again, Derek Trowbridge at Old World Winery has been sort of my viticultural mentor, and he's another grower that I work with. So, which is again all about trying to create intimacy between, what happens in the cellar and what happens in the vineyard, to understand. So I can go and help him in the vineyard, and I can spend some time out there and understand the fruit, understand the site, and that matters hugely. So that's kind of the best possible scenario. I'm not really set up to farm at scale, so everything I do is very labor intensive, and it's I don't have a tractor of my own. Spray everything by hand, and it's just a lot of work. And I'm not complaining, because I absolutely love it. I love being out there in the vines. And this is that's speaking of like all the hats you have to wear operating at the scale. I don't like putting on the salesperson hat, because I'm not good at it. I shouldn't say I'm a terrible business person, but I shouldn't jinx the whole thing. But I'm kind of a reticent business person,
Yeah, I get the feeling it's not your favorite part of
I mean,
the project.
If it were up to me, I would just be in the vines and be in the cellar as much as I can. But that's also just not the reality. So you can't bunker yourself in those places forever, Increasingly it's difficult to justify the amount of time it takes to farm the way that I want to farm, when I also have to sell wine. And that seems like what it's pulling most directly from.
Okay.
In terms of time commitment, and it's a shitty compromise because it's what I most love to do, and it's where I feel like it's why I first got into. I should say, I guess the reason I fell in love with natural wines because it was so grounded in farming.
Okay.
And as a reflection of the work you're doing as a farmer. And that to me made sense that it's a through line in the cellar, right? So one of my frustrations about the California natural wine scene, and my frustrations about trying to do all of this myself is that it's just really, really difficult to fold farming into the equation. And that sort of Vigneron model doesn't really jive here in California. And
that's true.
And that's absolutely okay. Like I think winemakers should not feel pressure to do that, because I know how hard it is, but it's a really difficult thing to kind of negotiate with yourself because it's what I want to spend my time doing for the most part. And it's so integral to the way I see the project, that I've never kind of really, I don't know, I've never been able to divorce and I don't want to divorce the farming from the project. And I do think that, increasingly in like the natural wine fairs, we're all so, and I'm guilty of this myself, like we're all so curious about process. And that seems to be where most of the discussion is drawn toward is, how did you do this? How many days maceration? Whole cluster, not whole cluster, all the various permutations. And I'll still get people like with some of my longer macerated stuff, let's say, it's 6 months on the skins or something. And again, this is just a very traditional method. I'm not doing it to, win any kind of, hipster points.
Sure.
But it does feel like that sometimes when people just really get off on that,
Okay.
And I get a lot of questions. It just, at these fairs, I should just simplify it saying, at these fairs, I get questions of process and no questions about farming. And I think it's because those of us who are operating at this scale a lot of us have just kind of decided that farming almost can't be part of the equation, or it's so hard to make it part of the equation that it's okay to let it go. And I think that's absolutely fine. But I do feel like some of the conversation, we've lost touch a little bit with being so anchored into the farming.
Okay.
And that's sort of sad to me, So it's all to say that regardless of what I do in the vines or how many vineyards I'm working with, or purchasing fruit, working with growers, it really is about trying to, have as close a connection to the fruit as possible. But I just love being outside, and I love working with the vines, and I love everything about it. And I didn't study it, in school. Okay. And so for me, I'm just, I just read as much as I can. And it's just, there's so much to know and so much to learn. And it's just incredibly exciting. And so I have to, I'm in constant sort of war with myself, just negotiating the desire to be out in the vines and also the importance I feel being out there, and certainly the importance I feel of having a close connection, whether or not I'm farming, with the fact that it just doesn't make any sense to do it at this scale, and it just, I'm not saving any money doing it. And there are not that many people, it seems, at least, it seems there are fewer people that care about it.
Okay.
But that's just my perspective. I think a lot of people feel differently about it, but it's just what it is to make wine at a small scale in California, trying to fold farming into it. And I don't mean to sound discouraging in any way, but it's a really, really difficult thing to fold in. And it saddens me that so many people, including myself, have felt like it doesn't make sense, and that we have to kind of drop these vineyards because it's not sustainable to be able to do all the things you need to do. And for me, part of those challenges have been just, trying to raise a young family as well.
Sure.
So your time is precious, and
For sure.
yeah, just tricky. You're tricky. There's the vision of there's the romantic vision of what you're hoping for, and then where you have your facility and your vineyard in the same spot, and then there's the reality, and then it just becomes a question of what are you willing to lose, and what's the compromise.
Yeah, and I don't think, and I think you know this, but I don't think you're the only one in that situation.
Oh, no.
There's been, I think, a lot of talk about it in the last couple of years, and a lot of other people I've talked to have kind of had that same realization of maybe pulling back and farming one small plot instead of 3 plots, one being 2 hours away, and just pulling in
keeping
a
it
little
tighter.
bit. Yeah.
No, I mean it's certainly the conversations that I'm having with a lot of peers, and just we're all still kind of figuring out how to make it work, and it doesn't. It's not always. It doesn't always align with what you think it should be, But yeah, I don't know. The farming is so. It's so, deeply connected to what got me interested in it. It would just be a real shame to not be connected to it. But I'm also increasingly seeing just how difficult it is, and it just sucks. But there are ways to do it, and I don't know. Again, these are all the conversations that a lot of us are having amongst ourselves, and similarly the questions of scale, because I think scale and the farming side of things as well, makes it more feasible, and just scale makes it more feasible, in the cellar. So yeah, it's a tricky thing to know where you want to be in terms of size and processing, and I'm very much in the camp of not wanting to be bigger than I am.
Okay.
But I'm also very aware of the challenges that this model has, and increasingly trying to tweak things to make it work and survive.
Yeah, there is that challenge. I mean, if you have your days full now, if you do grow, you have other people you're bringing in, and right now it's it's a very personal project for you. One man band with it. Yeah, and I'm not against the idea of hiring help at some point. It's just been, I just don't. And again, this is where maybe it's my failed business acumen, but I just don't really see it happening. And it's just been a tough couple of years with distribution, and as everyone's feeling. Sure. So yeah, it's a difficult time to feel like you want to double down on what you're doing. It's a time where a lot of us, I think, are figuring out ways to make it more sustainable, and I think it does feel a little bit like the decision is, okay, do I want to, if I'm going to do this full time, maybe I do have to scale up, and in whatever way I can make that happen. But maybe the best approach is to scale back to the extent where I could have a couple other gigs, and help support the volatility of the winemaking through it. So, like I said, I'm sort of in no man's land where I don't have the time, certainly, to have another job. Yeah. And, I already feel like I have 1.5 jobs, with the winemaking, but the salary doesn't necessarily match that, so just negotiating all those real world, those real world problems. Yeah. Yeah. How did your harvest go this year? 2024 vintage. Like so many people, I'm sure you've heard, it just incredibly fast. Yeah. And
really remarkable in the sense that all my fruit came in within 9 days. And
Wow.
that's never happened before.
That
It's
is fast.
pretty tight. Yeah, pretty tight. So it was just furious.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of those harvests where you kind of know what's going on, but after the last fruit comes in, you kind of have to pull your head out of the sand of processing and just understand what you did,
Yeah.
Where is everything? So it was really, really intense in that way. And also remarkable in that I was pressed out by the same calendar date that I started harvesting last year.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 23 was, a very late harvest. And, kind of the polar opposite in a lot of ways of this year. But all in all, I mean, I'm pretty happy with things. Okay. I didn't make quite as much wine as I made in 23. And that's, some of that is just the reality of just knowing I wasn't going to have the same kind of funding that or capital I've had in the past to purchase grapes. And also, I was farming a little bit more this past year.
Yeah.
So yeah, by and large, I'm pretty happy. I mean, the fermentations were pretty great. I was really worried about a couple. I picked things. So it seemed to be the biggest trend this year is having acidity that would hang on through larger ripening periods. Which in theory would make you think that you have these bigger windows in which to pick, but sometimes just the logistics of harvest, everything seemed to be ready at the same moment. But I guess what I'm saying is like I did have some fruit come in at higher sugar levels than I would normally be looking for.
Okay.
With acid levels that were in a nice spot.
Okay.
So the basic chemistry looked really, really good. And I even had some fermentations that I thought were going to be problematic that just zipped right along. And again, this is one of the advantages of having a somewhat earlier harvest. In 23, when things were a little bit later, it was difficult to, not everything was finished. The wines were kind of chugging along. They don't want to be in the bottle. Nothing's screaming at me to be bottled. And 22 was the opposite, where things were almost coming out of the press, like tasting like wine and ready. And so I think you just have to be, intuitive and open to, just have to listen and pay attention and not. That's the hardest thing to do, though, is to not force anything and just to kind of accept what it is. But I'm optimistic for 23. I made a lot more Pinot Noir this year just because it's what I was farming. Yeah. And excited about that. Yeah. And again, we were talking about this earlier, but Pinot's not the grape that I fell in love with. It wouldn't be my first choice necessarily, but I do love it. And there's so much of it around here. Yeah,
you're kind of surrounded by it.
Yeah, and here we are, we're in Sebastopol, and in the heart of Russian River Valley, and I've been making wine for almost 10 years, and I've never really felt compelled to work with Pinot, partly because it's out of my price range. To find quality organic Pinot is not cheap out here. Yeah. And it's kind of necessarily expensive because it's expensive to farm, you know, and disease pressure is high. But as part of this kind of tightening and trying to work closer to home and making more kind of logistical decisions and working with what we got, rather than trying to seek the obscure. Right. There's tremendous Pinot around. This is an amazing place. Yeah. There's a reason why there's so much of it planted here. It's frustrating in a lot of ways. It's a tease in a lot of ways. I think it's really unhealthy to have such a glut of one variety in one spot. Sure. But at the same time, in terms of how I'm interacting with that fruit, like I really love it. So,
what's the Pinot vineyard like that you're farming?
It's just a little over 2 acres. Okay. It's interesting site in that it's in Pengrove, and I guess it's technically in the Petaluma Gap. So there's some coastal influence. Yeah. There's a lot of fog that sits, which which means the disease pressure is really, really high.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely site in that it's been farmed organically for at least the last 10 years. And
Okay.
owner is tremendous. And that's the other thing I should mention is that when you're leasing vineyards, so much of what I'm looking for in a vineyard is like a good relationship with an owner and someone who's willing to work with you, because it doesn't always work out that way. And I would rather work with a vineyard that needs a lot of love and revitalization, but has a great, easy to work with human being behind it,
Sure.
versus the opposite. And I've been in both situations, so this is not that though. I mean, the vineyard is, it's well established. It's I believe just about 20 years old and producing around, just under 2 tons an acre. Parts of the vineyard are really struggling, but parts of it are quite healthy. It was moved over to quadrilaterals at one point, which is, again, just a bit of a challenge in terms of disease pressure and fog and Pinot. So it's just a lot of backpack spraying.
Yeah.
A lot of more leaf pulling than I would like to do.
Okay.
More canopy management, just a lot of time in the canopy, and just constantly checking in on things and fretting that there was going to be a mildew outbreak. And sure enough, there was, despite all my best efforts. So this is another reason why, after working with really disease prone varieties, I understand why folks want to turn toward hybrids and also like more arid environments and growing more, heat loving, like Italian head train stuff in, up in Mendocino, or like it's just, it's a difficult place to farm out here, in a way. It's just because of that disease pressure, and because those of us working organically and naturally and are trying to do as little as we can in terms of spraying, So that's been the biggest challenge. Okay. But yeah, there's mildew, which means, and again, that changes everything in the cellar, and we were able to get a lot of it out. But nonetheless, it was still, there was a decent percentage of it, and I was working with a crew that was pretty good, and, we were able to avoid most of it.
Okay.
So, but that was really, really the only problem, which is, a big one.
Yeah.
But it's a great site, and I think I'm really excited for the wine. Excited for the wine. We'll see.
Yeah. What else were you making this year?
So I worked with some fruit from Derek.
Okay.
And so more Pinot. So again, I guess I processed maybe 9 tons of Pinot this year.
Okay.
And I also farm a small little Pinot vineyard out here in Sebastopol too. Mm-hmm. That I've replanted part of the vineyard with Sauvignon Blanc.
Oh,
so
okay.
A little bit of a co-ferment. Yeah.
Oh, co-fermented.
That's the idea.
Okay.
I mean, I have no fruit yet, but I did co-ferment with another site of Sauv Blanc that I have this year.
Okay.
So a lot of Pinot. I have some Sauvignon Blanc. I have some Viognier, and that might be it this year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really a stripping down and trying to work closer to home.
Sure.
And trying to spend less time in the car, trying to spend less time away from the family, and working with what's around and what's available.
Yeah.
But this is a pretty remarkable year in terms of availability. Like if you're in the market to buy, it was pretty remarkable. A lot of the fruit that was available, just because the market is what it is right now.
Yeah.
And it was up over 100%. Like the wine business classified listings were. I'm sure you've heard this, but like yeah. So if you wanted some premier Napa Cab this year, you could get it for pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
But I think the majority of the folks I know are looking for ways to kind of tighten up a little bit. So
it seems like a lot of people kind of had that conundrum of maybe I should be tightening. Oh, there's this vineyard that hasn't been available for 15 years.
It's so hard, man. I mean, like we're all kind of addicts, you know.
Yeah.
When you're winemaking, like you can't. And this is really hard. You have to kind of divorce yourself from the business side of things at times, but then you can't do anything stupid either, you know. So, yes, to answer the question as to how this vintage was, I would say this year was an exercise in learning how to say no. Mm-hmm. Because there were so many amazing opportunities that floated through the space. And I just had to learn. I had to learn to say no because I knew I wanted to keep the cost down. And so it's really hard though, when fruit comes in and you know the value is incredibly high and you know the quality is incredible and you can have it for, you know, relatively, little. It's still, you know, $2,000 a ton is still $2,000 a ton times however many tons you're getting. It's still, it's difficult. It's a difficult time to just kind of blindly throw money around just because there's a good opportunity. But it is a big challenge because, like I said, I want to try to. I mean, I've always taken on new things every year, and I have a difficult time saying no. Oftentimes, especially when a great opportunity comes your way. Mm-hmm. But every now and then, you got to be practical. So I'm learning.
Have you ever given thought to working with Georgian grapes?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I would love to. And if I were to plant something of my own, I think that would be in the cards for sure. But out here, there aren't a whole lot of people that are growing any Georgian varieties. There are a couple things. You see like some Saparavi, I think, up in the foothills, and you know, maybe a couple other varieties, but not much. Yeah. So I mean, what a wealth of indigenous grapes in Georgia. So yes, it's incredibly compelling. I don't even know what I would work with, but again, it so much depends on the site. So I've learned to not be too concrete about any of this stuff. But that would be part of the vision if I was able to set up my own situation. And I've tried to get things, you know, other growers to graft over to other varieties, but nothing has happened in a meaningful way, I should say.
Okay.
Yeah. But it would be cool. But you know, at the same time, I'm pretty, I feel pretty fortunate to be, you know, working with the fruit that I am working with. Yeah. And I'm not aiming to make Georgian wine. I'm aiming to make Californian wine, you know? So, I don't have any, the nerd in me really wants to work with Georgian varieties, but, if it doesn't happen, I feel pretty happy with, you know, what's available to us out here. Yeah. 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 We're lucky. I mean, it's and increasingly so. And again, as we were talking before we started to record, I think growers are hopefully going to be increasingly, you know, more likely to plant rarer varieties as we see kind of a waning of interest in the homogeneous, you know, cultures of Pinot and Cab, and folks will, I think, discover that there's like a healthy market for lesser known varieties, especially when, you know, you have just a glut of grapes just hanging on the vines, you know, year after year. Yeah. I'm hopeful.
Is there anything we kind of missed or glanced over that you'd like to discuss, you know?
Not really. Nothing popping to mind. I guess beyond the fact that, like, you know, just to go back to the Queffrey. Yeah. You know, my intention was never to be a Queffrey winemaker. Okay. And I've really sort of struggled to define in a way like what my project is. The Queffreys have instantly provided that, you know, that kind of through line with the wines. But I'm indebted to the Georgian traditions, the Georgian techniques. I love working with the Queffreys. I am interested in Georgian varieties, but more than that, I think the goal always is for this not to be some absurdly niche project, but it's just to make make the best wine I can possibly make in a way that excites me the most. And that's always been the driving force. So it just sort of so happens that the Quevries sort of fell into place.
Right.
And I'm grateful that they did, but I'm still using oak and I'm still using stainless. When I see it, we'll make the wine that I'm hopeful of making. Yeah. So I'm not married to anything. I try not to be too dogmatic about anything. I try to be intuitive and experimental as much as I can be as well. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's just winemaking is one big puzzle.
Yeah.
That
how do you think your winemaking's kind of changed or evolved over the last 10 years?
Yeah, I was in the beginning. I was actually more grounded in what the Georgians were doing. I think I felt like a little bit more like kind of almost obligated in a way to follow a lot of those techniques and extended macerations and to push skin contact and to kind of and to be like more extreme and to work on the margins and kind of in the same way like I fell in love with beer, right? Like I had my IPA phase and then you learn to now I'm much more interested in the more subtle flavors of like lagers and kolsches and just lighter, more nuanced stuff. And the same with wine in the sense of maceration. I would say the biggest changes are just how I've learned to read the fruit and learn how to find the right balance between, because in the same way to me in terms of process, in the same way that I think carbonic wines can all kind of taste the same. They can be delicious, but they can be more similar than they are different, and maybe kind of remove themselves a little bit from, a pure expression. I think orange wines fall into similar categories. Sometimes orange wines can sort of begin to taste generically orange. And that's something that I was probably guilty of in the beginning. And I've just learned how to step back a little bit and how to read skin ripeness, how to read the individual vintage, what I can get away with, what I'm really looking for in terms of extraction, percentages to use, length of time on the skins, all of those little things. I'm just a little bit more dialed in terms of what I want. And also, this is the beauty of working with fruit, the same fruit for a long period of time. It just takes a while to really dial it in and to get comfortable. And so much of my winemaking has been a little bit schizophrenic in that I've worked with I've farmed a lot of different vineyards. I've worked with a lot of different sites. And this is what I mean when I say it's like a puzzle. I'm continually trying to figure out what it is I'm most interested in. Yeah. And I guess this is what I was kind of getting at with the Quevries, is that it's what was my initial entry point, my initial excitement. But at this stage, I'm really just looking to find the varieties that speak to me and looking to increasingly put my focus on the farming, even if I'm not doing it myself. Worry less about variety, and to find balance in my own life and to begin to make it work in the way that I kind of fell in love with the idea of like what winemaking could be when I was working in France, and that kind of that lifestyle of having of being able to do all the things and have it make sense to do them all, and so I think for me that's meant working closer to home, working with fruit that I feel really connected to.
Yeah. What's the best place for people to find your wines and try your wines?
Yeah, I mean, Usually,
Salesman hat.
yeah, exactly. See, this is it doesn't fit so well. Certainly Ordinaire down in Oakland, and the Punch Down, which we're very lucky to have an outpost here in Sebastopol. And when we first moved here in 2016, there really wasn't much of anything in terms of natural wine. We would have to go down to Oakland to get our fix, or the city. But now there's quite a few places you can actually kind of make a natural wine crawl through the city. So it's pretty cool. So yeah, Piala at the Georgian restaurant. Certainly the Punch Down, the Redwood. There's a place called Psychic Pie here in town. So yeah, locally, more places than I certainly had a few years ago. Yeah. And I would say, the folks that really have my wines consistently in the Bay Area are Ordinaire, Punch Down, Ruby, and smattering places in the city and in the East Bay. And then I have a distributor down in LA, and a lot of other places in domestically and abroad. And I tend to work with pretty small distributors now, and it's lovely because it gives me a bigger footprint than I sort of deserve. Yeah, it just it connects you with markets that have like real enthusiasm for the wines.
Right. Yeah.
And unlike some of the bigger, primary markets, which can be a little jaded and require constant, reminders of your existence. Yeah. So yeah, the wines are out there, but I wish I could say that they're consistently in one place or another. But yeah, you can always find the wines at those shops, and then I have a little web store online that I try to maintain. It's more or less up to date.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
But they're around. They're out there.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to add or anything?
Let's see. I don't know. I mean, what did we touch on that you think? I don't know if this is worth mentioning, but just how people, like, it's really interesting to me how people end up in wine, and especially end up in natural wine. And like my path into it was really, really unique. And it just as pretty much everyone else's is. And a lot of people are coming to it from other disciplines. And, I feel very fortunate in that, I grew up, my parents are both artists, and I kind of grew up in in that creative environment, but also in an environment where, you were encouraged to be an individual and to be, free thinking. And I think it's funny because I thought for a while, I think I felt like really disconnected from the kind of art world a little bit. And, I thought I was doing something different. And it's just been really fascinating to see how like all these parallels have begun to kind of pop up in the wine world. And just the ability, I should say, with natural wine, I think why I was drawn toward natural wine. And I think it is that idea of just of individuality and also like you have to have kind of like a fearlessness and a willingness to make mistakes. And the majority of the wine industry, and I didn't quite realize this until I got into it, but like it's necessarily like really, really conservative, because so much is at stake financially, especially at scale. And I just, just to make the point that the more individualistic you can be and the more risks you're willing to take and the more experimental you can be, it's all good stuff. And it's all, I think, what the industry needs to push in the right direction. And, to that end, I guess the other thing that we didn't really touch on that is kind of interesting to me is just where I feel natural wine was when I started and where natural wine is now. And it's very different. And I could complain if I wanted to about the way that things have changed. And I think there are some aspects of the kind of the scene that are a bit of a turnoff. But, rather than go too deep into that, I think, if we go back to this idea of natural wine being an extension of farming, and that's, where I first fell in love with the idea of making wine. And how, there has been, it feels like a little bit of a disconnect in the current scene from those roots of the farming roots, partially necessarily just because there are difficulties of making it happen in California. But I just kind of want to end on an optimistic note, which is to say that I do think that major inroads have been made in terms of what the farming looks like, and like large scale farming, and a lot of the bigger boys around are moving more toward organics, in some cases biodynamics, than if you compare it to where we were 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's a huge difference, and I think a lot of that is because of pressure that the natural wine industry has put upon other growers. And so anyway, I just don't want to be completely doom and gloom about all this stuff, because there's the other point to make, that those of us in the natural wine world are often inclined to kind of turn our noses up at the conventional world, and I think that's a big mistake. And there's just so much division, and there should be, we can learn a lot from conventional growers and conventional producers, but it's all to say that if natural wine set out in the beginning to be sort of this countercultural movement, well, it's made ingress into the mainstream in terms of farming, and that to me is like the biggest accomplishment. So I really do believe that natural wine has had like a really strong impact on the way that farming is headed in California. I think it's a positive direction, despite the fact that so many of us are struggling for access and it's so expensive and it doesn't really make sense. By and large, when we're really talking about natural wine, is through the lens of like kind of social change, there's been success there. And I think we're all kind of in it together in terms of making farming, and in terms of farming better. And just wanted to bring that full circle to the kind of the way that I saw the beginnings of natural wine, and where where is its landing spot. And I think it's still about the farming. And there's plenty of trendiness in fads that I think will fade away, but the stuff that will, leave a lasting mark, I think is going to be the way that the farming moves forward.
Yeah,
hopefully.
Great. Yeah. That's a great point to add. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's all so endless, and like I said, I don't want to be, it's really easy to talk about wine and to be kind of feeling kind of bummed out about it, for a lot of people. But I think if there's like a lasting, I don't know, if I'm speaking from a position of, someone who has a bit of experience but is still very much learning, speaking to someone who, who might be starting, I think it's so important to connect yourself to the little daily tasks that you love, and that's, I get depressed when I think about it in the macro, but when I can stay attached to the daily happenings, to the time spent in the vines, to the little, shitty cellar tasks, that would otherwise be shitty, but are somehow imbued with something more meaningful. That's what really keeps it worthwhile and keeps it, it's worth doing. Yeah.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Caleb. His wines are as good and as singular as ever. He's been working with Kevry as long as anyone in California, and the skin fermented whites are pretty amazing. Caleb isn't really on social media, but you can find his wines at calebleisureWines.com or at many smaller local wine shops. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.